Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm thrilled to be here to introduce the first event in OCSE's Global Conversation Series. This monthly series brings together Skidmore campus-based faculty and experts from our international programs and partners with the aim of providing truly global, substantive discussions regarding current issues and challenges that we all grapple with. There's an urgent need to hold these conversations and educate each other about our respective realities. Yet currently our students, faculty, and staff have restricted mobility and limited opportunities to engage with the outside world face-to-face. We hope the OCSE's Global Conversation Series will provide an opportunity for intercultural discourse and debate. This inaugural conversation focuses on Black Lives Matter around the globe. Today, we will hear from Winston Grady-Willis, Director of Skidmore's Black Studies program. Professor Grady-Willis recently returned to Skidmore College as Professor and Founding Director of Black Studies. Most recently, he was the inaugural director of the School of Gender, Race, and Nations at Portland State University. Winston has supported in principle the Black Lives Matter Global Network and continues to engage in intersectional teaching, research, and activism that affirm Black lives globally. Winston will speak about the historical and current U.S. perspectives on Black Lives Matter. Our next speaker will be Esther Mayoko Ortega. Professor Ortega is an associate professor in the Skidmore in Spain program and is the coordinator of the Laboratory of Anti-Racist Pedagogies in that program. She holds degrees in philosophy of science, feminist theory, history, and American anthropology. Nowadays, she's teaching and researching on critical studies on race, gender, and sexuality, as well as researching on the social studies of science, especially focused on the intersections of gender, race, and biomedicine. Currently, Mayoko is part of the queer-feminist-antiracist movement in Madrid, Spain. Mayoko will present on the Black community in Spain. Finally, we will hear from Skidmore's Rachel Cantave, Assistant Professor of International Affairs. Professor Cantave holds degrees in anthropology and public anthropology. Her research explores the relationship between morality, race, religion, and political values within multi-faith Afro-Brazilian communities in northeastern Brazil. Rachel teaches courses on cultural theory, research methods, race, religion, and identity politics in Latin America and the Caribbean. She is published in the Journal of Religious Studies, History and Society, and has several forthcoming articles and edited book chapters. She's also co-founder of the ebonytower.com, a multimedia platform supporting the experiences of Black academics and BIPOC PhD students. And she is co-producer of the documentary film Sexuality, Looking for Life. Rachel will present on the Brazilian perspective of Black Lives Matter. If you have questions, please use the chat function. We will address them during the Q&A session at the end. And now I will turn it over to Winston Grady-Willis.
Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. And these groups were at odds just as they were confronting colonialism and racism, the reality of lynching here in the United States. So that's that first key moment, the 1920s, 1930s. As many folks know, we don't have time to get into it here, but one consequence of some of the contested territory among these groups was that Marcus Garvey would be imprisoned on trumped up mail fraud charges and eventually would be deported. So if we fast forward, if we move forward about 40 years and we come to the 1960s, then of course we're talking about the Black Power movement, not only in the US, but globally as well. Here in the United States, there were a number of groups. One, the Republic of New Africa, which argued for an independent Black nation state in the United States, southeastern United States. There were other groups. There was a cultural nationalist organization called the Congress of African Peoples that was led at one point by poet laureate Amiri Baraka. There was the US organization, another cultural nationalist organization. And the most famous group of all, the most well-known, of course, the Black Panther Party. So why is this important? The Panthers made this decision, particularly the Oakland Panthers, to argue that they were the, quote, vanguard of the revolution, right? That they were the group, that it would be the group that would take center stage. And so we know, again, that among these different groups, and we would add the Congress of Racial Equality, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, these groups sometimes were in coalition with one another, they were allied with one another, but they often weren't, right? And sometimes the tensions were deadly, okay? So let's move now to this moment. So this Black Lives Matter moment. We know now from the past few months that there's been an upsurge in activism in the US that's just been extraordinary, multiracial, multi-generational, incredible moment. But it's important to be able to look at another tension. And this isn't necessarily a tension between groups, but a tension between this notion of Black Lives Matter, right? The phrase itself, whether you see it as a slogan, whether you see it as a call to action, right? The tension between that and the actual organizational apparatus that from which the phrase was born. And so most of us are probably familiar with the story, right? 6 years ago of the founding activists, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, Opal Tometi, their decision to launch that hashtag Black Lives Matter in the wake of the death of Trayvon Martin, and then eventually also the death of Mike Brown. Okay, and so we're familiar with that. But what we sometimes lose sight of is the fact that there's actually an organizational apparatus, which is now the Black Lives Matter global network, right? That's connected to some, but not all of the activism that's taking place now. So what I want to share the screen and just to kind of point one key thing. There have been protests throughout the country, most of them very localized, grassroots groups taking center stage. Some of these groups have what might be called a partnership affiliation with the Black Lives Matter global network. Many of the groups don't. But what we often don't do, and let me do this quickly, is just have a sense of how many formal partners there actually are for the Black Lives Matter Global Network, or actual chapters, excuse me. So these are the formal organizations that are tied to the specific mission of BLM. And so what's very interesting to note is that there are 17 of them in the United States, or in North America, 14 in the US, and 3 in Canada. Okay, 1 in British Columbia, and 2 in Ontario. Okay, so just if those of you who have a sense of the US map, you'd be familiar with Los Angeles, Santa Barbara, okay, Denver, Chicago, New York City, Boston, okay, this is Nashville. But you'll notice there are a lot of places where there's no official, formal Black Lives Matter presence. In some places that you might assume there might be a presence, for instance, Seattle or Portland, the presence isn't there. I mean, there's the presence in British Columbia, which is close by, but that leaves a question to be considered about what moving forward is the relationship of all these protests, this incredible protest activity, and then the BLM Global Network specifically. And then the last thing, and this is a way that I want to just kind of remind folks of how Black Lives Matter really is in conversation with the Black Panther Party. Those of you who are familiar with the Panthers know that its platform was based on this notion of what we want, what we believe, right? And so almost as an homage to the Panthers, but in a key departure as well, And this is just from the Black Lives Matter website. I tell folks all the time, actually check it out, the website, and you'll notice there are 15 principles associated with what we believe. And I've intentionally highlighted this first one because it speaks to what we're talking about today, that there's there's intentionality around opening up this conversation transnationally and internationally. And then the other issue, and this is absolutely, I think, one of the crucial, really foundational ways in which BLM has made a mark on this historic moment is the extent to which the guiding principles of the organization are fully gendered in every way. And so I'm gonna end it there. My brief moment is up for now, but I really encourage individuals to go to the website itself and to look at how explicitly heteronormativity is challenged, patriarchy is challenged, really important. And my key question now is, to what extent, as this movement continues forward, will this organizational apparatus, the leaders of it, the members of it, to what extent will they truly frame the conversation moving forward? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Winston. That's wonderful. Now we're going to hear from Mayoko.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and good evening here in Madrid. Thanks to everybody, especially to Cori and of Campus Study Office of Skidmore College for inviting me to this global conversation. And sorry for my English, okay? So I'm going to talk about Black Lives Matter or something like this in Spain. And I think to talk about this Black Lives Matter in Spain, we have to talk about the past and understand, in order to understand our present here in Spain, specifically. So let me start with this idea, remembering the past. For me, a crucial reference is Gloria Becker is an Afro-Surinamese professor in Utrecht University. And she wrote White Innocence, Paradoxes of Colonialism and Race in 2016. And in this place, in this book, she made this key question: how it's possible for a nation that has been a formidable imperial power for close to 400 years, she talks about the Netherlands, but it's the same case for Spain. So to imagine that this history will not have left traces in culture, language, in knowledge production, and its conception of the self and the other. So with this question, I want to come back to the relationship we have here in Spain with colonialism and slavery. So this is a history of erased knowledge by our colonial memory in Spain. Spain is founded as a kingdom under the paradigm of whiteness and the rejection of non-white population from 1492 to the present. So the expulsion of Jew population, the expulsion of Moriscos, ancient Muslim population, among them there are a lot of Black people, and laws and regulations against Roma people. So the narrative of history of colonialism in Spain are characterized by the denial of any relationship to or any responsibility for slavery. Another main point, I think, is the systematic denial of any link between Spain and Blackness or Black Afro worlds and communities. So there was a significant percentage of enslaved and freed Black people during the modern age in Spain, but this history is erased. This denial is produced and reproduced over the centuries and continues today. This is the point. This erased memory, or colonial amnesia is the name I prefer, in relation to last American colonial territories like Cuba and Puerto Rico in 19th century, but especially regarding colonial territories in Africa like Equatorial Guinea, whose independence was from Spain was in 1968. So what's happening to Black lives in Spain today? So in a point, we are not linked with the Spanish body of the nation, because I think we have here a very important difference with the US, because here in Spain, a Black person is never regarded as a Spaniard, as Afro-Spaniard or something like this, but rather as an immigrant, generation after generation. Another main point, I think, is the invisibility of Black people in prominent positions. Few Black teachers, physicians, civil servants, and so on. So here we have young Black people rise without positive public role models. For example, I never have had just one single Black or racialized teacher, nor in the primary school, in the high school, or in the university. Never, ever. So structural and institutional racism in legislation is in all important areas of life. It's something important, I think, in very important in our legislation. For example, Immigration Act is a very main point of institutional racism here in Spain, and connected to European Union politics as well. So structural racism is reinforced in school curricula. No Black protagonists, no history of Africa or African colonies, a highly distorted and critical history of Spanish colonialism. All this is what's happening to Black lives here in Spain today, and it's a consequence of this past. So now I want to put here at this point some facts that mark the recent history of institutional racism and our responses as community. So we have here in 2014 in El Tarajal, in Ceuta, the border police fired rubber bullets and smoke grenades at Black African migrants who were inside the sea, in the water, trying to arrive to the beach, to the Spanish territory, killing 14 of them. The deeds of Samba Martinez, Idrissa Diallo, Mambai, and others until 2020, and the murder of George Floyd. And this is an important point, because with the murder of George Floyd. We are in the middle of pandemic here in Madrid, but a lot of people, thousands of people in Madrid gathered in front of US Embassy to protest George Floyd murder, and this is important, to reclaim Black lives in a global context. Black lives include all Africana and African descent lives, not only African American. For Black people in Spain, it's important not to distinguish between African, Afro-Spaniards, this is a strange category, or all the Black people from Spain's ex-colonies or the global Black and diaspora. I want to share here, let's see if I can share this. No, I can't. Let's see. Yeah, could you see this? Yeah, okay.
Yes, yes.
This is some pics of the demonstrations in different places in Spain, of these demonstrations about George Floyd murder and all Black lives, including Black lives here in Spain. So this is something that in the Spanish newspapers and so on, they are very fascinated because of these demonstrations and these things. But this is a consequence of the long-term activism of Black, Afro, and Africana community in Spain. But I think we have some points in this recent activism that are different from the past. These points, there is an intensification of Black and Afro activism in the last, I think, 5-6 years here in Spain. We have here the creation of multiple associations and activist groups, almost in the big cities. And these groups are, and this link with Winston talk, these groups are formed and some are led by collectives of young Black women and queer and questioning people. So this is a main difference, because new leadership in a movement traditionally led by heterosexual Black men. So I think this is very, very important. And another point, another main point, at least for me, is the creation of a lot of groups and associations of African migrants, more specifically in the south of Spain, protesting the labor conditions in agriculture. These African workers live in inhuman, I want to emphasize this, inhuman conditions, no electricity, no clean drinking water, working 12 to 14 hours a day, and so on. So this is, I have another, I want to share the screen again to see here, this is the living conditions in the agriculture in the south, not only in the south, but mainly in the south of Spain, Almeria and Huelva, and a lot of similar places, you know. This is the house of these fundamental workers, you know, because they are considered fundamental workers. So we have all these components, and in the big cities, we have these groups of African workers in the street trading called manteros, and they are pushing a lot of to reinforce our community. No? So with all these elements, I think we have another main point is around these demonstrations for George Floyd and all the Black lives. We have the creation of TENAE. TENAE is the translation, should be something like Black, African, and African descent community in Spain. And we have these, and another main point, I think, is the alliances between different racialized communities here in Spain, POC, people of color you talk about. So nowadays we have these alliances between Roma community, Muslim community, Latinx communities in this new, all of this is new, I think, in the Spanish activism and anti-racism. So finally, I want to conclude talking about what we want, you know, because we have two main proposals. One is the short term. In the short term, we have this campaign called Regularización Ya. This campaign is for immigration justice for undocumented migrant people residing in Spain. Many of them Black people from Africa, of course, and many of them essential workers during the COVID-19 pandemic in undervalued, feminized sectors of economy like agriculture, care services, domestic and care workers. So this is the short-term goal. And in the long run, we have some goals too. First is a census, should be a census, racial ethnic self-identification. I have to say that in Spain, there's no questions in the census related to race. So, and this is a heritage from the past, you know. So we don't know how much people identifies as Black or Afro live in Spain. So, and linking to this census, we want public policies focused on Black communities, of course, but designed by Black communities. And finally, we think is another main point is think about educational changes. So, and this is linked with politics of representation. We know representation is not the only thing, but in this case, with invisibility, absolutely invisibility, representation matters a lot. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mayoko, very much. And now we turn to Rachel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Cori, for putting this all together. And it's so wonderful to be in conversation with Winston and Mayoko. I decided to make beautiful slides. And so we're going to look at them, which is fine. I thought we were doing a slide thing. So let me share my screen. And so today I'm going to be talking about Black Lives Matter, Vidas Negras Importam in Brazil. And I want to just couch this conversation by pointing out that my work is really within religious communities in Brazil, which have also been in discourses around politics and Black lives for along perhaps all of Brazil's history. So I'll talk about that a little bit. But, you know, there's just so much work and scholarship and Brazilian scholars and activists who are doing this work. I just want to point out that I'm just trying to augment their voices, but I really recommend you all go look for the Brazilian activists and scholars who are talking about their experiences in Brazil. So I thought I would orient this discussion by pointing out that in 2010, then President Lula instituted the racial equality statute. And this is important to note because Brazil is the country that received the bulk of enslaved Africans through the transatlantic slave trade. Often people note that Brazil is the country with the second largest Afro-descended population outside of Nigeria. Those numbers and questions about race are quite complex, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But all of this is to say, Brazil is also the last country to abolish slavery in the Americas in 1888. All of this is to say that it takes almost 201 years for the Brazilian federal government to actually put together any sort of policy that would address the stark legacy of slavery and its effects on Black and Brown populations in Brazil. The racial equality statute did several different things. It funded the government institute known as Palmares Cultural Foundation, which is responsible for promoting cultural, historic, social, and economic values of Black society in Brazil. It also created the national system for the promotion of racial equality. And so one of the things that that organization does is ensure that at the state and municipal levels, people are actually following the policies that were a part of the racial equality statute. So for example, children previously did not learn necessarily at school and generally did not learn at school anything about Afro-Brazilian history or contributions, Afro-Brazilian contributions to the nation state. But through the racial equality statute, they start to. The statute also develops a national reporting system, or Dial 100, where people can call and complain or to lodge a complaint, a legal complaint for occurrences of racism in Brazil or discrimination. And finally, the statute also allows for the adoption of affirmative action policies in Brazil. And this is both in schools, but also for the much sought after public sector jobs in Brazil. And you're seeing in that little box a cartoon that is showing the differences between private or particular schooling in Brazil and public schooling. The best colleges in Brazil are public colleges that you don't pay to go to, yet access to them is exclusive because you have to pass the equivalency of the SATs in the US and receive the highest marks. So you can imagine how public school systems that don't have the best educational systems are not a pipeline into those public institutions. Instead, the private schools for long periods of time have been the pipeline into public institutions for jobs in higher education. Another thing that is important to remember about the Brazilian experience and Black Lives Matter discourse is that Brazil for a long period of time was known as and perpetuated this mythology, national mythology of being the racial democracy. And the racial democracy, if you think about how democracies work, right, that there is equal representation and participation by all. This is a national mythology that says, oh, the three races that comprise Brazil are the African population, the indigenous population, as well as Portuguese or European, Euro-Brazilian influence. And that all three of these come together in harmony to forge a population in Brazil that is mostly mixed race. And racial democracy is a theory and a discourse, a narrative that's crafted in the 1920s, 1930s in Brazil, especially in relation to what's happening in the US and looking at racial segregation and racism in the US and saying, oh, we don't have that type of overt racism in Brazil. That discourse was challenged pretty early on by many different scholars in Brazil. One in particular talked about Brazil as being slightly different from the US in that prejudice or discrimination happens by, quote, mark rather than by origin. So if you think of the US racial project of the one-drop rule or hypo-descent, that any lineage or any non-white heritage makes you Black or not white. In Brazil, it's not necessarily a point of discrimination that your origin or that your heritage is partly Afro-Brazilian. However, the more you assume physical characteristics that can tie you to Afro-Brazilian heritage, that is the thing that gets utilized or drawn on in order to perpetuate anti-Black racism and prejudice in Brazil. So things like hair texture, skin tone, and color rather than racial categories for a long time has really had prevalence in Brazil. Even when it comes to census categories, there's a category that is Black, preto, preta, and then there's a category for brown, which is a sort of catch-all for people who might be any version of the mixture between Indigenous, Afro, and Euro-Brazilian heritage. The way that the racial democracy has made talking about race taboo, and also it also has made it difficult for larger portions of the population to mobilize around racial justice issues in Brazil. But that is not to say that there isn't a long and strong history of resistance amongst Afro-Brazilians in Brazil, starting all the way back to the beginning. So any place really that had enslaved Africans also had people resisting enslavement. Brazil is known to have many famous maroon settlements, or places where enslaved Africans and Afro-Brazilians sort of escaped to and set up their own secluded settlements. And Zumbi is one of the most famous leaders of a maroon settlement in Brazil. And so Zumbi has been a symbol for Black power movements in Brazil historically. And these organizations, similar to how Winston was discussing the contestations within groups, the Black power organizations have been at different points sort of in tension with, but also collaborating with Marxist movements in Brazil, labor union movements in Brazil, etc. So I want to move us to contemporary times. So in 2010, to reorient us, Brazil is starting to have more open discussions about race, and talking about racism becomes a little less taboo. And there are certain events that have spiked within the Brazilian population recently, this mobilization and call for action that has used the Portuguese translation of Black Lives Matter as a rallying cry. The first occurrence I want to talk about is the assassination of Rio Councilwoman Marielle Franco that happened in 2018. So Marielle Franco was a councilwoman in Rio, an LGBTQ activist, a member of the Socialism and Liberty Party, who, after being a vocal and outspoken anti-military intervention and lawless policing in Rio, someone who was counter those movements in Brazil. In March, after giving a speech, she was driving home and her driver were assassinated. And to this day, the specifics of the murder are unclear, but also very suspicious. So 2 ex-policemen have been identified as being the people who shot at their car. And one of them was at one point a neighbor of the current president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. And there are reports that there are ties between one of those men and the current president's son, Carlos. But either way, since the death of Marielle Franco, you'll find her picture and her name popping up in different organizations and movements oriented around Black Lives Matter and also anti-police brutality movements. There's also been several, too many to count, accounts of children who have gotten caught in the police operations, militarized policing against criminal units and drug trafficking units, especially in Rio de Janeiro. Recently, May 18th, there was a 14-year-old João Pedro who was shot at his aunt's house. The house was riddled with bullets. We know that he died from a police rifle bullet lodged in his back. And again, there are so many accounts regularly of children who are caught in the fire between police and different criminal organizations in Brazil. And more often than not, most often, there is no justice for these children. There is no repercussion for the police officers who recklessly killed people, including children in Rio. And most recently has been the death of a 5-year-old named Miguel, whose mother is a domestic worker for a mayor and his wife in one of the northeastern states of Brazil, Pernambuco. The 5-year-old boy was left in the under the watch of the boss, the mayor's wife, while his mother went to walk the family dog. And it was caught on security tapes that the wife left him alone in the elevator shaft, just wandering the building. And he fell from the 9th floor and died. And this case has really galvanized and emotionalized the Brazilian population, in particular because the woman who left him wandering the building alone went to the police station, paid a $20,000 bail, 20,000 Brazilian reais bail, which is the equivalent right now of about $4,000, and remains free until her court date. And the hypocrisy for people of how a Black domestic worker would have been treated had she neglected a child, a white child, who ultimately died, is just, it really points to the injustice and the way that racial privilege is given to white Brazilians, especially white Brazilians, to avoid having any accountability for their actions. What you're seeing in the top right on the t-shirts are Brazilian celebrities who have been wearing these t-shirts that were made. One of them says, "If we have laws, they're for everyone." Again, calling to the disparity and unfairness of how this woman was treated ultimately. I think another important thing to think about, though, when looking at people protesting right now in Brazil, is that mass protests really sort of sharply increased in terms of the number of people engaged in them and coming out after the election of current president in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. There was a strong woman-led movement, similar to how we had the Women's March in the US, except it was a sort of consistent movement of women under the hashtag Ele não, or not him, never him, is what they were saying about Jair Bolsonaro, who, if you don't know, is a quite problematic figure who has been on the record saying anti-Black, misogynist, homophobic things before he campaigned and throughout his presidency in Brazil. And so I do want to point out too that Winston and Mayoko pointed out the inclusion of women-led movements and LGBTQ movements in this current BLM conversation. And a similar thing is happening in Brazil, where you're seeing a lot of overlap between women's rights organizations going out right now for Black Lives Matter. And also you're seeing some overlap between the LGBTQ community as well, coming out for Black Lives Matter, also being a part of Ele No, or not him. And I finally want to say that the situation in Brazil is quite grave and has been discussed by activists and by scholars as being a living under a genocidal state. And when people say that, they're not being it's not hyperbole, especially with now everything that we know about COVID-19 and how it's impacting most especially Black and Indigenous communities in Brazil. So just to give you a sense, and not to draw comparisons to say that one is better than the other, but just to sort of give you a sense, in 2019, in Rio de Janeiro, which is just one state in Brazil, killed more than 1,800 people. Whereas in 2019, there were about 1,004 Americans shot and killed by police across our entire nation. So when people say that they're living in a genocidal state, they are talking about rates that are quite stark in terms of police brutality and murder, as well as the number of people who are most affected and dying from coronavirus. And this isn't the racial consciousness and these politicized movements are not specific to Brazil. Right now is a very interesting time for Afro-descendancy throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. It happens to coincide with the International Decade for African Descent, which the UN had determined to be between the years of 2015 and 2024, with the goals of organizing different movements and sort of organized around the theme of bringing recognition, justice, and development to Afro-descended communities across the Americas. And it's unclear whether that is actually happening, but it is clear that there has been more conversation in localized environments across the Americas discussing Black Lives Matter, police brutality, and how governments have been basically not engaging with the after effects of enslavement and the social inequalities that are disproportionately affecting Afro-descended people in Latin America and the Caribbean. And for example, I just threw up here the recent killings of 5 Afro-Colombian boys in Llano Verde as being an example of how it's happening in different countries. But there's a sort of collective consciousness around Afro-Latinidad right now. And so I just wanted to end by giving people access to some more information. It's obviously not enough time for me to tell you everything about these movements, but if you're interested in learning more, you can check out these different organizations. Thank you. Oh, sorry,
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out how to stop my
Unshare.
screen share. How do I do that? Here we go.
All right, great. So thank you so much, Rachel. That was really, it's just amazing how this is such a global movement. And I really am so glad that we were able to have 3 such distinct perspectives, yet there's so much overlap. We were supposed to have some time for the three speakers to have some cross dialogue, but I think if you guys don't mind, I'd like to open it up for questions because it's now 2:53, so I know some people will need to leave right at 3. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. And if you don't, then perhaps people would like to, the speakers would like to have a little bit of a cross dialogue. Give people a minute. So I'm not seeing any questions yet.
I have a question. Can I?
Yeah, please do.
Mayoko, I was interested in, towards the end of your talk, you talked about the relationships between these different types of groups in Spain, like African immigrant groups, as well as Latino groups in Spain. And I'm assuming also the category that you kind of said is like ill-formed, the Afro-Spaniard category. So someone who's been in Spain, but is Black for many generations. I wondered if you could talk about the relationship between those different groups.
Sorry, the relationship between
African immigrant groups who are interested in Black Lives Matter with Latino groups, immigrant groups, as well as Afro or Black Spaniards who haven't immigrated in recent times to Spain.
Yeah, it's not an easy relationship, but we are trying to change this for a new relationship of more confidence between different positions, between different African descent people. But the living conditions are really different too. So the intersections between the main difficulty we have here is of course, for African people here is the Immigration Act and the language. So these are two main points here, because people from Africa, migrants from Africa, have a different relationship with immigration law, because they are, in general, they are not from Spanish ex-colonies, so they have more difficulties. But I think it's not only this. I think it's the color line, and the human and inhuman or non-human, and people from Africa here and Black people here identified as Black people is not. We are not talking about this human life. And as you see in the agriculture sector, these are the living conditions here for these people. Right now, we are trying to articulate much better this movement, and I hope we are trying to this and finding this, because in the last mobilizations, with mobilizations for George Floyd and all Black lives, are led by these people, by African migrant people, at least here in Madrid. So we have a hope.
Thank you, Mayoko. I have another question, I think for all three of you. How do you see the future of the movement in each of your countries? So the countries you're focused on.
Well, I'll just say that here in the United States, I think a key issue will be the extent to which activism is seen as being almost exclusively performative versus the extent to which we'll see actually significant substantive change with respect to policing, the criminal injustice system, incarceration. There are just so many issues, not to mention the continued assault on trans lives, particularly the assault on the lives of trans Black women. So this issue, the tension between the performative and real systemic change, I think that's a really, really important issue, particularly in the next year or so here in the US.
Yeah, I would add and say, I think a similar thing is happening in Brazil. There is a lot of digital activism, and I think that the extent to which these movements are able to maintain their the numbers that are showing up and the interests will be integral to the long-term effects of these movements. Unfortunately, I also think that with a few more years of a Bolsonaro presidency, similar, like at the US right now, right, is at a turning point. But in Brazil, that presidency, there keeps being spikes of these such obvious anti-Blackness that re-galvanizes people. So there's a lot more space, I think. Whereas I wonder in the US, if we have a change in administration, if people will sort of feel like, oh, I can relax now. Someone asked me, I just want to say it quickly, about how effective Lula's attempts at racial justice reform and Bolsonaro's response to that. And I just want to say, I think that to judge the effectiveness is a little bit difficult because he was the first person to even formally be collecting these numbers. And it's unfortunate that after that comes Bolsonaro, who does revoke this formally, structurally, I would say. So he's put someone at the head of that Palmares Foundation that I told you all about, who is describes himself as a Black right-winger who doesn't believe in the victim mentality, who has said that he doesn't believe that racism is a problem in Brazil. And so that's the sort of structural revocation of the racial justice reform that Lula had tried to put in place for Brazil.
Mayoko, do you want to talk a little bit about what you see for Spain and Black Lives Matter in the future?
I think I reinforce the idea of Winston and Rachel too about what's the next for our movement, you know? And I think as Winston said, we have to think about, this is not only, of course, it's not only a performative moment, but it's about living conditions, you know, for the most of the Black, African and African descent people here in Spain. So we have at some point, we have a privilege, because we have the legal documents. We are Afro-Spaniards or something like this, but, and of course we have a lot of problems, but never ever like an African migrant here right now. So this is the point. This is one point, and the other, it's about the importance of all Black lives, including queer questioning, and most of all, trans women, Black lives. So this is the main point here too. So let's see. We are pushing in this way.
Yeah. Thank you for your answers to that. I have another question that is, I'm not sure who it's directed to, but it asks, What is Skidmore actively doing outside of this wonderful dialogue, thank you, to protect and support its Black and Indigenous students both on campus and abroad? So as the director of off-campus study, I can speak a little bit to the abroad piece. First of all, we work very closely with programs like this, like the Skidmore in Spain program, which at its very center has a philosophy of social justice, equity, access. And so what we try to do is really make sure that we are always at the front of discussions with our programs about how they're supporting our BIPOC students and how they are addressing the issues that the students run into. It's unfortunate how many conversations I have to have with program directors and representatives throughout the year, but I have to say we are fighting that fight as much as we can. And so I would encourage students to let us know if there are any issues that they run into with any of the abroad programs, because we are definitely here to, again, fight that battle and make sure that the folks on site, the teachers, the staff, the families are getting the appropriate training to understand the types of anti-racist practices that we expect of our programs that our students go to. We can't control everything, obviously, but we're doing what we can within our sphere of influence. As far as on campus, I mean, I can't really speak to on campus as much. I don't know if anybody on this call can, and if you can jump in.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say that some Black students organized an important virtual rally during the summer to raise some concerns about how they feel literally on this campus, right? And then the very first day of the school year, there was a rally and then a march to the president's residence organized by some students connected to Pass the Mic, which is a student group on campus. And so there's some real concerns, particularly around some of the protest activity and the police response. Not only the Saratoga Springs Police, but actually more importantly, the Saratoga County Sheriff's Office, the response to some recent protests here that Skidmore students were a part of, where pepper spray was used. There was an armored vehicle that was brought out. And so there's been a lot of discussion, including around this COVID-19 moment, the fact that a number of students had to stay in Saratoga Springs, not on campus, concerns about, about safety. And I know that President Mark Connor has addressed some of these issues in his new initiative for the year. So there's definitely some movement from folks at a higher level of pay than anybody on this panel, on this discussion. But again, it remains to be seen, because not only are there issues of physical safety that students are concerned about, but also just the climate in the classroom. What's happening? How are these issues being dealt with? So there are a number of folks on the faculty, on the staff, who are really interested in working with students, working with the larger administration to, again, not exclusively be performative. Though I want to be clear, some performative acts are really, really important, right? But to also deal with meaningful change on campus as well.
I would also bring up that there's the Committee on Intercultural and Global Understanding, CGU, which is making, and I've been on that from the beginning. It's been over 15 years now. Co-chaired it with Winston, actually, for a few years. And this year, one of the things we're taking on is assessing our bias response practices and what we can do to actually make that more effective, and work with students, especially for issues in the classroom. In addition, there's a climate survey that was conducted last year that we will be rolling out the results this year. We were supposed to last spring, but COVID kind of took that off the table for us. And so there are things that we can do that we're working on, but there's a lot of work to be done. And I'm cautiously optimistic about where we might be able to go under new leadership at the college. So we will see. So let me see if there are any other questions. Somebody asked, how do you think social media has impacted both positively and negatively the movements in the countries you all spoke about? That might need to be our last question. I know we're already over. Does anybody want to look at that quickly? Answer that quickly, I should say. How has social media impacted positively or negatively the movements? Anything?
I'll say that in Brazil, social media, similar to here, has sort of amplified voices that might have been previously more difficult to pay attention to. So for example, recently there was a panel on Globo, which is like a CNN channel basically, on racism in Brazil. And they had 5 pundits and not one of them was Black. And on social media, Brazilians started talking about it and using hashtags and putting pressure on TV Globo to do it again with an entirely Black panel. So in ways like that, I think social media is useful. It also sort of puts all of these different issues into conversation in ways that I think that can be useful. So there are conversations happening in Brazil around representation, like that example I just gave you. And now it's sort of also becoming a conversation about affirmative action and people who are frauding the system by claiming that they're Black, but might not be perceived as Black in Brazil. And then putting that in conversation with these Black death via militarized policing in urban centers. But I bet the other panelists can maybe talk to some of the negative aspects of social media as well.
Well, I know one thing, and again, full disclosure, I'm not as tied to social media personally as I probably should be, but one negative impact, I believe sincerely, is that social media can be an incredible force for bringing people together, but sometimes when there's such a reliance on it, here in the US, sometimes when folks actually get in the same room, or it's time for face-to-face interaction, work, dialogue, it's really, really difficult to do. And so it just means that we have to work harder at being able to bridge social media with what needs to happen on the ground, not only on the streets, but also in City Hall and what have you. Yeah.
Well, I agree with my colleagues, but yeah, here I think we have some advantage with social media, but I want to focus on not only in the social network we use. This is a positive point. Use the social media to connect in different parts, and for example here in Spain or over the world. But the other point, not only the social media, but the TV or whatever. And here we have the same problem, invisibility of Black people or Black prominent people in the media. And on the other hand, we have very negative images of Black people in the media. So pros and cons, but it's not only a social media, but the newspaper, the news, and yeah.
I also wonder, just from a bystander perspective, if social media has allowed a lot more performative allyship rather than actual action too, Winston. I wonder if you would agree with that.
No,
Yeah.
I think, I think we've definitely seen that happen. At the same time, though, I want to be fair. I think sometimes we as Black folk, people of color, have also kind of shut some white folk down immediately, right at the snap of a finger, instead of also allowing some room for some mistakes to be made and for some growth to be had. So, I mean, so it's, I know there's some layers to it, but to answer your question, yes.
Yeah.
It's definitely happened.
Well, wonderful. Well, we have run over, and I thank everyone who was able to stay. I can't thank Mayoko, Rachel, and Winston enough for coming and sharing your perspectives. This has been really fantastic. I am so happy with how this all went for our inaugural global conversation. And thank you everyone who came and joined in. I think this has been just beyond what I expected. So very, very pleased with it. I do want to just announce that our next, in October, I don't have a date yet, but our next global conversation will be on the topic mindfulness in times of crisis. And so we will send out information about that. But again, thank you to everyone. And I'm just so pleased. So everyone have a wonderful evening and take care. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Mayoko.
Bye.
Thank you, Rachel.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
Cori, you rock.
You guys rock. You guys are awesome.
Thank you.
It was wonderful.